Have you ever noticed that whenever you show someone something that you've made out of wood, be it a small box or even full-size pieces of furniture, the first thing they do is they touch it. They run their hands over it and feel its surfaces. It's the way humans are wired. We look with our hands as much as we do with our eyes. And after spending so much time on a project, pouring your heart and soul and even your wallet into it, the last thing you want is someone's first impression to be spoiled by a rough, bumpy finish. You want those surfaces silky smooth, and that means knowing how to properly sand your project, including between coats of finish. That's what I'm focusing on today, demystifying what has to happen between the coats so every wood finish will come out looking and feeling perfect. You can apply what you learn in this video to any clear film finish, such as polyurethane or lacquer or even shellac, and whether you brush it on, you wipe it on, or you spray it on. I'm going to assume you've already sanded your bare wood surfaces smooth. If you need help with that, I have another tutorial that will tell you everything you need to know. I also have a tutorial on how to apply the coats of finish. Look for those in the links below this video. This lesson begins after you've put on the first coat and you find that the surface that was once nice and smooth is now rough again. Two things have likely happened. A little bit of dust from the air has settled onto the wet finish, or the wood fibers themselves have soaked up that finish and become swollen. You can reduce the effects of swollen fibers by raising the grain before you apply the first coat. That's covered in the other sanding tutorial. But it may still have occurred to some extent, especially if you use water-based finish. So you'll need to sand those fibers back down. I recommend around 320 grit for the first coat. And do it by hand with light pressure. You don't want to sand the entire coat off. But depending on how swollen the grain is, you might still end up turning more of this first coat of finish into dust than you will on subsequent coats. By the way, if your sandpaper is gumming up, you'll need to give your finish more time to dry. You should get fine white dust on the surface, not little boogers of partially dried finish all up in your grit. I always sand with two hands, one moving the paper across the surface, and the other feeling for imperfections that must be sanded away. Again, use light pressure, but be thorough. This first coat will become the basis for all the rest, so you want it perfectly smooth. When you're finished, clean off all the dust. Don't blow it off with compressed air because all that is going to settle back down on your next coat. A vacuum works nicely. Follow that up by a wipe down with a little mineral spirits or denatured alcohol or even just water. But don't get it too wet because if you don't have much finish left on there, the water may still soak into the grain and re-raise some of those fibers. After the second coat of finish is dry, you shouldn't have to deal with the fibers as much as the dust that's still in the air settling back down on the wet finish and drying there. Unfortunately, these dust nibs just can't be avoided. I have a separate, theoretically dust-free finishing room in my shop, and I still get little dust nibs. You just have to deal with them by sanding them away. But you don't want to keep sanding off all the finish as you're putting it on. So at this point, switch to a finer grit. I like around 600. The process is the same. Work by hand, going with the direction of the wood grain as much as possible, and use very light pressure while feeling the surface with the other hand to find areas that need attention. Usually after the second coat, I start putting on all subsequent coats of finish very lightly, because the thinner the coats are, the quicker they dry, and the less time there is for more dust to settle and stick to the surface. Now, dust nibs are a little bit less of a factor, but another phenomenon can pop up. All finishes shrink as they dry, some more than others, but they all do it. As the finish shrinks, it can pucker on the surface of the wood. You probably can't see it, but you can feel it. The solution is the same, very light sanding with 600 grit. There's one more factor that you probably never considered. Many finishes, especially those that are oil and alcohol based, may be partially redissolved by their base solvent. So a can of polyurethane, for example, contains polyresins and mineral spirit solvent. As a coat dries, those mineral spirit solvents evaporate away. But when you put on the next coat, you're adding new mineral spirits, and that can partially dissolve the previous coat. With some finishes, such as water-based poly, this isn't a factor, but others, it's unavoidable. Shellac, for example, will always redissolve because it never cures. Oil-based polyurethane, on the other hand, does go through a chemical curing process that will eventually permanently harden it. But this process can take a long time, maybe even a month before it becomes resistant to solvents from the next coat. So this means the longer you can wait between coats, the smoother the next coat may be. Again, this is just one of many factors that we've been discussing that you have to consider. You can wait a month between each coat. You're still going to have to sand away dust nibs and other things. But when you get to your final, thinnest coat, it may pay to give that one as much time to dry, at least partially curing, as possible. I like to wait at least 24 hours between coats, sometimes even a few days before applying that final coat. That final coat is usually the thinnest as well, and as such, you can't use 600 grit to sand away the last teeny imperfections. So I'll switch to 1,000 to 1,500 grit to buff out that final coat. In fact, I often use a brown paper bag. It's cheaper than high grit sandpaper, and if you've minimized all those causes of a rough finish up to this point, that paper is going to make your finish smooth as glass. Try it on your next project. It'll make a huge difference. Here's something else that's made a big difference in my shop. It's just a couple of cuts. Your ears will be fine, right? They will be if you have your IsoTunes Bluetooth earbuds in, because you'd already have your ANSI certified hearing protection on because you're listening to your favorite music and podcasts. And you're supporting a small family business at the same time. Please use the link below this video to learn more and to show them you support what we do as well.